Good afternoon. Welcome to the Space Madness podcast. This is your host, Jeff Nosanov. And today we have a very interesting and timely guest and topic. Our guest is Matt Petit, a geopolitical and African affairs specialist currently at Vannevar Labs, but whose extensive prior experience includes 17 years at the Department of State and detail at the White House. So really excited to talk about the subject. The subject being space and Africa specifically in strategic conversations going forward. Matt and his co-author recently published a very interesting article about this. I saw it, and I think it's one of the most underappreciated areas of space competition and discussion in the world. And I'm really happy to be able to share it with you all today. So, Matt, thanks for joining me. Please, if I left anything out, if you could name your co-author, that would be great. And we'll get started.
Sure. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to have this conversation. My co-author is Maureen Farrell, who is vice president at Valar and was a colleague of mine at the National Security Council at the White House a few years back.
Okay, great. So I do want to spend most of our time talking about the actual article on the topic, but I'm curious I always like to know, how did you find yourself in this career? What led you to this as your calling?
Calling's a good word. I actually came into the Foreign Service with the State Department directly out of my undergraduate studies, thinking, this is it. I'm going to have this 30, 40-year career. I'm going to serve the United States, serve the people in the Constitution, and I'm going to go see some cool places and do some cool things to boot. I think that was a viable assumption at the time, and that was how a lot of careers had shaken out. But as, we move forward in time, and the pathway in and through civil service became a little bit shakier. And as I had my own personal realizations about my family and stability, I thought, it's probably a good time while I'm still young to make a transition, learn some new things, and see how I can better serve the mission, albeit less constrained to being inside the government. So That led me to Vannevar, which is a mission-oriented national security tech company, but also to start thinking about how I can contribute to the broader conversation on these mission-related topics. How do we protect the United States writ large, not thinking about very narrow views of national security, and how do we, as people with diplomatic skills and background, translate those into commercial results that have this impact on our personal and national security?
Well, that's really compelling. Thank you. I can relate to contributing from the outside. I think that combined, we can do the subject justice here. But I also am trying to do my best to contribute to space exploration from the outside for the last 10 or so years. So I can relate to going from inside to outside. So on that, just as a sort of as another topic of introduction, obviously, if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably interested in space. You probably find this interesting. But I constantly struggle with getting more and more people to pay attention to space in general. And that's never been harder with all the other stuff going on. I know why we should pay attention to Africa and space, but to start sort of our substantive discussion, why should the average American who isn't even paying attention to American space efforts go there and the next level in, which is African and other nations' space efforts? Why does it matter to them?
Absolutely. First and foremost, I'd say we need to look at the Atlantic. We share the Atlantic with Europe, obviously, and we anchor a lot of our negotiations and discussions around foreign policy and economics on the transatlantic alliance. But transatlantic also can mean Africa. If you look directly across latitudinally toward Africa from the United States, you're looking at Florida, you're looking at South Carolina, you're looking at Georgia. If you're taking this from a space perspective, you have all sorts of opportunities to see over the horizon into the United States, and most crucially, to provide guidance systems and telemetry to advanced weapons capabilities, to include hypersonics. Now, China does not have over-the-horizon sight lines to the U.S. over the Atlantic from where they are physically. If they didn't have a set of ground stations in Africa, and in Latin America, I should add, they'd have to rely on water, basically, seaborne relays on their ships that are costly, difficult to move, and easy to detect, defeat, and deter. So how they've plugged that gap is how we used to plug the gap. And this is one of the core tenets of the piece, is the United States used to have a robust set of ground stations, of tracking, of diplomatic relationships in Africa to help not only military, intelligence, and scientific endeavors, but also to help secure civilian space programs. So we had a landing and tracking facility in what is now Somaliland that would trace the descent of orbit. You can talk about this better than I can, but would trace objects coming out of orbit, including manned objects, as they fell into the Indian Ocean for retrieval.
Okay.
We had significant relay stations across the African continent to include Nigeria and Kenya and Ethiopia. We had other stations in places like Eritrea. At this point, that's all virtually gone. And what it's been replaced with is not just ground stations for China in Namibia, in Kenya, in various other places across the continent, but it's diplomatic agreements with these countries that help their space agencies, help satellites that they co-develop or develop endemically, ride share up into outer space, and provide China with a broader constellation of partners, pun intended, as they reach their cislunar, lunar, and broader space ambitions.
Yeah, and there's a lot there, but they are broad. There's a report recently about their outer solar system ambitions, doing, where my heart really is with the Voyagers and studying at, the real edge of where the sun has an influence. I mean, there's no reason, and just from what I've seen, which is I'm sure less than what you've seen, there's no reason to believe they can't do this in the near future. And that would be a shame to give up that frontier. So I want to reiterate that the very first thing you said was that geographically, the African region provides basically a weapons tracking site with a direct line of sight to the United States. That, I think, ought to be about as clear a message to anyone as to why it matters. Now, you mentioned that they're doing what the U.S. used to do. So why did we stop or back off,
I think
at least?
Absolutely. I think that there was a broader shift in partnership efforts toward the African continent after the Cold War. Now, the tenor of Cold War relationships with African states led to some incredibly difficult relationships between the U.S. and these African states, many of which are very well documented in the reports along intelligence agencies and military operations on the continent, and are things that the United States has to grapple with now. The Soviet Union was very well entrenched across quite a wide swath of Africa, and still its successor state, Russia, benefits from a lot of those training and other relationships. As we are entering into another bipolar environment, we are getting into a state where the United States and China are now these two powers that are competing over territory and relationships in Africa. Now, I'm going to stop right here and say, at this point, you could be forgiven for thinking, this guy is just another one of these, strategic competition, U.S. versus China. When the elephants fight, the grass suffers. Africa's just a field of competition guy. And to that, I'll say, absolutely not. Go ahead and read the article, and I'll talk about this a little bit later. There are distinct sovereign advantages that African states have in this competition that they can and should be exploiting for their own needs. And I think that this current moment gives these states a lot more agency and leverage over these powers that are coming to them, and specifically to choose between the commercial offerings that are coming to their doorstep. That gets them better competition, that hopefully gets them a better price, a better deal, and in the end, better products that they can use to safeguard their people. One thing before I think we turn to that, you asked a great question, Jeff, about why Africa and space matters. There's actually another angle to this, and that's in everybody's cell phone. We've talked a little bit in media about cobalt, niobium, neodymium, praseodymium, all of these rare earths and critical minerals that you hear a lot about. Where are they? I'm sure they're in the United States to an extent. Some of them are in China, some of them are in Latin America, but quite a lot of them, and the ones that are needed for advanced technologies, including that space technology relies on, are in Africa. So again, not only is China's dominance over Africa and ground relay a threat from the skies, it's a threat from the ground. U.S. space companies have to rely on processing of these raw materials, which goes through 95% China. So they have both an upstream and a downstream problem.
Yeah. Wow. I think one of the things that came to mind while listening to you just now was, I had read that China is basically building roads from Egypt to South Africa, and all along the way, more or less extracting various commitments, long-term commitments from the nations that benefit from that infrastructure. And so I like the way you phrased it, that perhaps at a high level, we're offering them the American way of commerce and markets, so to speak, and China's offering them, sort of state-owned / state-leased facilities. And is that an oversimplification, or is that a good framing?
Not at all. I think that's correct.
Okay.
And I think it also speaks to the comparative advantage that the U.S. space commercial sector has.
Mm.
China is very well advanced in certain types of capabilities and research, but almost
Mm.
all of that is housed in state-run, operated, and funded laboratories, universities, and even military and intel establishments themselves. The U.S.
Okay.
has a far more robust commercial space sector by orders of magnitude than China does, than anywhere else in the
Mm.
world, with the slight exception of the combined resources of the European Union. So
Mm.
where you have a larger sector, you have more variegation in the offerings. So anything from ride shares for small microsatellites like
Mm.
CubeSat, big time space exploration, research capability, cooperation with African
Mm.
scientists. They can pick and choose along those lines. They can become trained and have exchanges with these companies and others, and they can attract investment from those companies as well that benefits them. And then if something doesn't work for them, they will move the market to go toward another one. I don't think you have that same competition within China at this point. There are some
Mm.
space startups that are just getting going. So now is the time when we have a comparative advantage, when we have competition inside the US space sector to
Mm.
give competitive offerings to partners like Africa, help them, help their people, and help us pursue a broader strategic advantage and objective.
So two things kind of diverge in my mind here. One is I want to talk about the rare earth elements. I love telling people that their cell phone has half the elements in the universe in it. And most of those probably are most economically mined in China, even if getting them out of China maybe adds some layers. So maybe that's just more of a philosophical musing. But the other point is, I'm curious, do you see across, or in your research for the piece, do you see across the commercial space industry in the U.S. that the African market is on their radar and that they're actively going after it? Or are they waiting for something like a federal kind of push or incentives to do so? Because really, in reality, all the space companies, everyone wants, no matter what they say, everyone wants the government to be their main customer, right? Even if they say otherwise, because they want to project the perception of a growing space sector.
I mean, I think you know this better than I do, but the U.S. government is going to represent a decreasing market share of potential customers for the commercial space sector as they begin to grow. I just don't think that the U.S. government is going to have the funding to sustain the amount and types of companies that are coming up and vying for contracts. So to maintain their own growth, they're going to have to look external for partners. That's something that not just space companies, but technological companies across the U.S. government are doing. So is Africa on their radar? Frankly, no. And that was one of the reasons why Maureen and I wrote the article, was we've been focusing on this from a policy perspective. We've been involved with some of the policy efforts like the Artemis Accords to bring in African countries, but we've not seen the same sort of follow through, with rare exceptions like the Starlink, which has 29, I think, partner countries in investing in Africa. If anything, the Starlink example shows that if people do show up and hustle and offer terms that are favorable, they can be first movers and gain that first mover advantage.
Well, it would seem to me that the various imaging companies like Planet Labs and others would find plenty of customers at the national level in Africa, because then they get, I would imagine those governments get the benefit of space assets without having to build them. So I'm curious if maybe that's just part of their overall data platform, that anyone can go in and get imagery from, anywhere, subject to some restrictions. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting test case. And I think one that Maureen and I pointed to in our article, which is African countries have specific and at sometimes existential needs for things like overhead imagery. I understand you had a Nigerian gentleman on your podcast before and mentioned that counterterrorism is one of their biggest use cases. Of course it is. In some of these countries, they have only 40% control over their territory, whereas 60% has free movement by terrorist groups, speaking to Burkina Faso. Others have been essentially split in half because of terrorist threats. Nigeria not only has several terrorist groups, but also rampant banditry. What happens when they try to target these groups is that they do so with either very little overhead confirmation, or they have to rely on very expensive or restricted partner assets and resources. Then if they don't have good confirmation and they go in without that, what can happen is what's happened many times for the Nigerian Air Force is that they will have significant civilian casualties that only help the terrorists' case, that the government is not out to help you. They're out to target minorities. So when I was speaking to the leverage that African governments have, it is rooted in their sovereign interest. Maybe it's counterterrorism. A lot of states in West Africa have that as one of their main interests, but maybe it's deforestation. Maybe it is effects by climate change and changes in hydrology that they want to map. Maybe it is nonviolent migration that's still going to have a strain on their resources. Maybe it's poaching. Depending on the state, they should be able to define the objective and then use that to define the terms of working with a U.S.
Sure.
company. Where I think the U.S. government and other instruments like the Development Finance Corporation can come into play is developing arrangements that bring in other parts of the U.S. government that say, okay, instead of paying out cash for access to this, you have access to finished technology, a certain proportion of the imagery or control of the satellites. And then we are going to not only help not only extract some of these critical minerals, because that is frankly part of the goal, but we're going to do local beneficiation around those, building jobs and infrastructure and power and roads leading to them. And then we're additionally going to build up the knowledge base writ large across your economy, which is going to continue to compound and help create jobs. So in this way, they're not only providing wins for the U.S. strategically, wins from a U.S. commercial perspective, but also wins at a national government and on the ground. The hidden benefit here is that when you don't have money changing hands under the table and you have an tangible benefit like safety and security from overhead imagery, that reduces the corruption incentive, not eliminates it, but it makes it harder to grease palms, which is something that a lot of our competitors do and that we're prohibited from doing by the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and good ethics.
I see. So thinking again about China's kind of long-term plan, I think you said the 11th 5-year plan. What a concept, a plan for 5 years that they actually perform, right? I think you'd have to, I think a reasonable person would have to acknowledge that China is capable of making long-term plans and keeping to them. So over the last 20 or so years, what has been the U.S. government's sort of observation and why haven't we intervened is probably the wrong word, but why haven't we engaged already with this clearly happening? Or was it clear to us? I don't know.
I think that this is one of the features of a democratic system. And this is where single party systems that are controlled by small groups of elites are going to be able to make decisions much faster and then implement them much more consistently.
Okay.
Does it represent all of the will of as many of the people as possible? Probably not. But it certainly is faster, and it's going to more agilely move capital and resources into position. To the question of has this been acknowledged as a problem, in part, and I think by Africa and other professionals, it has been over the past few years, but it's only at this time when we're thinking a little bit more critically about geoeconomic competition and what would be necessary to have access to some of these future technological needs that we're starting to get creative and think about them.
Okay. One of the reasons I asked that is the NASA Deep Space Network has a number of antennas that are down right now for various maintenance and damage issues. And so it's pretty shocking to see the U.S. Deep Space Network at a lower capability than usual while China has a nearly global, I mean, ours is global too, but how they've made such incredible gains. And you mentioned there were several sites in the shuttle era. Did we just pack up and go? I mean, why? Well, I'm curious. There must be stories out there about how we left them, but you'd think we would have kept them up once we had them kind of indefinitely. Do you know anything about that? That's a pretty specific question.
They're costly to maintain. The relationships with those governments change.
Okay.
In the case of Cagnu Station in Eritrea, you know, that was there when Eritrea was part of Ethiopia. So the countries themselves change. And then, of course, we have a very adversarial relationship with Eritrea. So Cagnu Station, you know, the housing for the military personnel who operated it is still there, and you can still see it from the city, but it's been abandoned for 30 odd years at this point.
I see. Yeah, it's interesting because to me, space exploration has always been one of the great unifying activities of humanity. You know, there's no boundaries on the actual Earth, and physics doesn't care about the geographic boundaries between one satellite and another. But of course, the almost pragmatic day-to-day operations and staffing and who keeps the power on, it depends entirely on these human systems. Okay, so understood. So it's been a slow recognition that was slowed down further by our system of representative government and our 4-year kind of decision cycles. So What about from the resource industry? You mentioned the critical minerals for metals for phones and aerospace and everything else. Is this not something that, let's say, the aviation industry has had their eye on? I mean, surely all these costs start showing up in various sectors, over time, or is it in the noise?
It's definitely getting a lot of attention.
Okay.
I would say space is probably one of the lower rungs in how you rack and stack which industries are being most affected by these choke points on critical mineral processing. I talked about cell phones before. What is making the news now is high intensity magnets that, of course, are required for industrial scale manufacturing, for high technology like AI hyperscaling. Quantum computing relies on a lot of these resources. Our military technology and deterrence capability also relies quite a lot on it. Thinking about this worldwide, not just looking at Africa, you have this long-term and global equation that you essentially have to solve. So China has been building up a chokehold on processing capability and to an extent mining and extractives over the past 15 or 20 years. Now they hold 95% monopoly on processing for certain minerals, meaning once they flip that switch and say, we're no longer exporting, the U.S. is basically scrounging around looking for what we can find in our own backyard versus in allied jurisdictions. And that's going to drive up the cost and is also going to cause scarcity, production delays, and supply chain disruptions. So the equation is, okay, how do we reduce China's overall dependence? We probably can't reduce the numerator, but we probably can increase the denominator. So where do we build more processing capabilities in friendly jurisdictions, or while we are also building that processing capability in the United States? We have these minerals in the soil in the US, but it's going to take a long time to build and scale industries that can not only mine them, but also process and bring them to market. We can more cheaply and faster build processing capabilities in places like Peru or Kenya or Australia that are in more friendly jurisdictions that we can then ship at lower cost to the United States and then increase that denominator, reduce that overall percentage of control that China has on finished materials.
Sure. And yet another thing that doesn't care about geography is where the heavy elements ended up in the earth, right? Like that just was a planetary formation. I love when stuff goes all the way back to planetary formation.
And they're in the asteroid belt too. So if the Chinese get out there, then they have that chokehold too.
Yeah. Yeah. So I read an article the other day. I'm really glad I read it before this conversation. It made the point that so the question is going to be about like domestic corporate policy and how that affects the flows of resources and so on. And maybe you can guess what company I'm talking about. I read that Apple has basically spent more money every year training Chinese facilities to work with advanced semiconductor manufacturing and basically building phones. Spent more money annually than the entire Marshall Plan. Something in the 30s of billions of dollars annually, training 3 to 5 million workers in China to produce these. So I'm wondering where or if, a domestic, and this was apparently done relatively quietly starting about 10 years ago. And as much as I like my phone, and now that I'm looking at my desk, everything that's on right now was probably made over there, probably by Apple. But I can imagine an argument that says, well, I mean, let's be honest, everybody. We're sending the demand and the supply over there, right? We're creating the and training people to make them there. So is there a role for domestic regulation of outsourcing, or something even maybe that term doesn't even cover, like not just outsourcing the work, but literally training entire populations of other countries or state level sized populations to build our gear for us? Where does that fit in anywhere?
It's certainly one of the tools that the national government has at its disposal. There's a bureau in the Department of Commerce called the Bureau of Industry and Security, BIS, that primarily has control over, or has jurisdiction over export controls. And they make the rules and then they enforce where the administration of the day's policies are going to go. Depending on the policy alignment toward China or other destinations, they can put certain entities or activities or sectors on this list or create a new rule around them that can ratchet up or down some of the export controls on those commodities, IP, or personnel going overseas. One of the things that I think is important in considering this global equation is that there are probably going to be times when we have a good relationship with an origin country or a country that can do that refining capability. It could even be China. There could be a world in which we have a better relationship with China. That's not the world we're in right now. We have an adversarial relationship with them. So it's incumbent on national leaders to consider, okay, what is going to happen if we get into a Cold War or, God forbid, a hot war type scenario with China? What levers are they going to pull? And then how is that going to affect our supply chains? What should we be doing day -1, day -1,000, day -2,000 to put ourselves in a better position? Similar to the argument that I was making about African countries needing to vary their supply relationships when it comes to providers of this type of technology, it is the United States needing to come up with a broader variety of suppliers of these materials inside our own soil, in friendly jurisdictions, and sometimes in less than friendly jurisdictions. So at good times, we can do the things that, as you said in the article, it alleged Apple had been doing over the past few years. And in bad times, we have other options that don't then see the same restrictions in supply chains that we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yes. I'm just thinking about how basic furniture wasn't even available, probably built from wood from somewhere. I mean, on a simplistic level, it seems like if you're pulling tons of cobalt out of the ground in China, or if that's where it is, probably ultimately the most cost effective to not move it halfway around the world, to put it in something else and then move that. But I do know that there are fruits that are picked in one country and then processed in another, so I'm probably way out over my skis there. But it seems like a very goal-oriented solution as opposed to slogan-oriented solution. Any goal-oriented solution is going to have a lot of different moving parts from all over the federal government, probably requiring participation from large corporate entities that could otherwise oppose things like saying, hey, you may not trained 5 million workers overseas. So it seems like quite the challenge. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about the Wolf Amendment. From my world, we see China. Hello, this is my assistant Wednesday.
She heard Wolf and said, "Okay, now's my time to shine."
A frequent guest on the podcast. What I have seen over and over again from NASA, including in my earlier years when I was more naive, I saw China doing something that we're trying to do and thinking, man, it would be great if we could work with them. What do you think of arguments to repeal the Wolf Amendment, that being, for the audience, being a general prohibition on NASA working with Chinese state actors, scientists, and so on? What do you think?
I mean, I think it's incumbent on the Congress to make and adjust these laws depending on the reality of the situation. The reality of the situation now is that working with China is too much of a threat to U.S. national security. So in that vein, I would say, I don't think the time is right to do it. This is just Matt's personal opinion.
Sure.
But, as we advance this conversation further, we get more articles out there, more companies that are involved in this, and begin to change how the market looks, maybe there are going to be adaptations that could cause changes to that law. I think there are folks in Congress who are interested in looking into this in a little bit more detail. But I saw a story just a couple of days ago that said the Department of Defense had inadvertently sent $2 billion to Chinese research institutions through grants and other things that could be violating sections of law similar to the Wolf Amendment. So is it the right time now to repeal it? I don't think so. Could it be done in the future when we are in a different environment? Yeah. I know that's not like the best answer to your question. But...
Well, no, it's a great answer, actually, because I'm not sure if it's an irony or a paradox or whatever, but one of the stranger things about working at NASA, kind of the solar system scale thinking or beyond even, is you often find yourself running into walls on an everyday life basis. Like, yeah, humans could work together and do these incredible things, but no, we can't because 10,000 years of human history, right? So I found my perspective kind of shifting from the grand to the practical frequently, where, like you just said, even if we could, let's say, let's say there's an asteroid coming and it will take all of humanity's cooperation to destroy it. Can we put aside or deflect it or whatever? Can we put aside our, enmities for our survival? The Game of Thrones season 8 question.
I don't think that should be brought into being any mention of the Game of Thrones final season.
Yeah, and hopefully, if that really happened, it'd end better. Well, it's really an interesting set of questions. So where does your piece fit into kind of the larger dialogue? Well, I should go even farther back. How do you identify a demand for something like that? What does it mean to put it out there? How do you know if you succeeded? That kind of thing.
I think to an extent you have to create the demand.
Okay.
If nobody talks about it, then it's unlikely that it's going to become something that just appears spontaneously as an idea. There are obviously going to be first movers and visionary thinkers who say, hey, this is an untapped market and go for it. But it probably takes people with some policy experience in Africa and other places to say, hey, I know that Zambia had tried a space program in the 1960s, or I know that Senegal has this CubeSat that they developed domestically that they're doing ride shares, or hey, I understand that Egypt is part of the international lunar system that China is trying to build. So it I think takes more people speaking out from different backgrounds to start generating these ideas and get the engine humming so that we can get people on the ground. Another thing that a thing that would indicate success to me is people coming up to me and asking me afterward, so what do you think about this? Or have you thought about this? Asking questions, poking holes in the argument, which I absolutely encourage. Coming in and saying, okay, it's great to approach this from a policy and academic sense. How do I make this happen?
Sure.
I will say I have had people come up to me after the article has come out and ask all of those questions. So from that perspective, I think it has been successful. The ultimate measure of success, in my opinion, is getting more people talking about it. So the more articles we see like this, the more boardrooms consider, hey, why don't we think about an investment here? Why don't we, sponsor an exchange here? And the more the U.S. government pays attention to all of this, then I think the better a conversation we're going to have about implementing these and then having those on the ground successes like the article envisions.
Okay, so it sounds like you're trying to create the commercial demand or the demand conceptually that is responded to with the policy change because enough entities that would be affected by that policy stand to benefit, right? So you're not, your audience isn't Congress, it's the people who then go and influence the Congress.
I, of course, would never position myself to be influencing Congress because I'm not a lobbyist.
Poor choice of words on my part, but you know what I mean.
But I think that's the crux of the article.
Sure.
Something that, humbly I'm observing transitioning into the private sector is, in public sector, you have all these tools and resources and smart people, and there's a temptation to think that you have all the answers. And there are a lot of very smart people who can frankly move much faster in the private sector and are also responsible for a lot of American jobs. So how is it that we can get those companies thinking in this way so that, as you said, they create the demand, they move the conversation forward, and then the U.S. government starts considering these policy changes? I think if you look back into U.S. history, it is social, political, economic demand signals on the ground from the bottom up that are most likely to change things in Washington and state capitals.
I see. That really, I think, crystallized it for me. Thank you. Particularly the jobs argument that in the pursuit of further growth, that highlighting these regions like African countries as larger possible growth than maybe would be obvious, that connects all the way back to Main Street, so to speak.
That there's also a smart and frankly necessary way to do this, which is not coming in like robber barons and taking the materials out of the soil and leaving Africa with nothing. It's building equitable arrangements. I'm not talking about ESG. I'm thinking about this in a different way that gets them in the technology conversation, because people in those countries not only need that technology, but they're going to contribute to it. There are already African innovators and companies out there who are on the front lines of this research. They should be involved in this conversation too.
Yes, and I think that would set up for a longer, perhaps a slightly flatter curve, but a longer one of growth and mutual benefit. So suppose there's a space company CEO listening to this right now, and they say, I want to explore that. So what do they do? How do they follow your lead, so to speak, if they're hearing this right now?
I'm happy to talk to them.
Okay.
There are a lot of other people who haven't been lucky enough to publish an article with the Atlantic Council who are thinking about this and would be great contributions to this conversation. There are people who have increased business acumen too, who can come in and help advise them. So, if there are people out there who are interested in this intellectually from a business perspective, I'm happy to keep that conversation going.
Okay, great. Well, that sounds like a great resource for anyone listening. So as we come to a close here, what final thoughts would you like to leave? I mean, I think you've taken us on quite a journey, starting with the vision of Chinese weapons navigation systems pointing at Georgia, where I live, and into this, very large global marketplace of materials and talent and infrastructure and so on. So how do you wrap it up? Or what do you want people to walk away with?
I think I should say, look, I've spent most of my career in and covering Africa, but not all of it. I also covered Iran. That's my coffee mug.
Mm-hmm.
I also served in India. I worked in Armenia. There are other diplomatic relationships that we should be leveraging, and there are other countries that have their sovereign interests that should be playing into this. Many are in Latin America. Many are in the Indo-Pacific. So just talking about Africa is, I think, an important part of the conversation, but it is only one part of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
The other that I would say is, I think we need more ideas out there. I think we need more people who are coming out there and willing to talk about this. And part of that has to do with coming in and then potentially out of government and sharing the experience of that transition, of the combination of those backgrounds to whatever sort of compromise position or new ideas might arise from it. I mean, you're in a similar background, Jeff, where you spent so much time with NASA, now you're out of it. I'm sure you have like a different perspective, still valid as your colleagues who remained in NASA, that can then complement and build on what they're doing from the outside.
I'm certainly doing my best, and this podcast is part of that, because I want all these different stories told, and I want everyone inside and out to see how all this stuff is connected. So I thank you for your contributing to that, because this is a big part of the space discussion that I'm not seeing anywhere else. So I'm glad to be able to share it. So with that, I think we're going to close this episode of the Space Madness podcast. Matt, thank you so much for joining me, and we'll see you all in the next one. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.